The collapse you never saw in Princess Diana wasn't about crowns, scandals, or the glittering cameras that followed her every move. To the world, she was the people's princess, a symbol of grace, beauty, and kindness who seemed to carry a fairy tale life. But behind the elegance and endless admiration, she was quietly unraveling in ways the world either couldn't see or chose not to. That's the paradox that makes her story so haunting. How could someone who seemed to embody love and compassion also carry such invisible suffering? How could a woman adored by millions end up trapped in isolation, pain, and despair? Not in spite of the spotlight, but partly because of it. Diana's story isn't just about glamour or tragedy. It's about appearances that fooled us, about the hidden collapse behind beauty, kindness, and service. And to understand why her end felt so unthinkable, you can't only look at Paris in 1997. You have to look at the quiet fractures she carried all along. And those fractures began right where the world thought her story was most magical. From the outside, Diana's story looked like history's most perfect romance. A shy young woman chosen to marry a prince, stepping into a royal dream that millions watched unfold. The wedding, the gown, the golden carriage, it seemed like a page pulled straight from storybooks. The cameras captured a spectacle that reassured the world. Here was proof that fairy tales could come true. But what appeared as destiny to the public felt more like a role Diana had been handed, a script already written, one she hadn't been allowed to shape for herself. Behind the glitter, her reality was far lonelier. Marriage didn't lead her into intimacy or partnership the way the story promised. It led her into an institution with strict rules, cold routines, and walls that kept her isolated from genuine connection. Surrounded by grandeur, she often felt invisible. What was celebrated as a triumph of love often felt to her like a trade, her private self exchanged for a public role that left little room to breathe. The private truth was that Diana had very little agency. Her schedule, her clothing, her words, even the way she moved in public, all were orchestrated, monitored, and controlled. The princess became less a woman than a performance. And while millions adored her image, the woman beneath it struggled with an aching sense of being unseen. She once admitted, "At the age of 19, you always think you're prepared for anything, but actually, you're not." It wasn't just inexperience, it was the crushing weight of being cast in a role too heavy for anyone to carry. Philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote that society often prefers appearances over truth, that we cling to illusions because they comfort us. Diana became one of those illusions. People wanted to believe her story proved that beauty, status, and romance guaranteed happiness. The smiling princess in the carriage was easier to celebrate than the lonely young woman crying behind palace walls. And so, the dream was never real. Not for her. The public saw the crown, but for Diana, it quickly hardened into rules, routines, and isolation. This was where the collapse quietly began. Not in the streets of Paris years later, but in the earliest days of a marriage that looked perfect from the outside and left her unraveling on the inside. The crown wasn't only heavy, it came with a script. Days were planned to the minute, routes mapped before she ever left a room, gestures practiced until they looked effortless. Wardrobe choices arrived with seasons, not moods. Speeches were written by others. Even small talk had instructions. Her body language was choreographed too. How long to hold a handshake, where to place her eyes, when to smile, when to move on. From the balcony to the car door, her life ran on script. But the strict choreography wasn't just about rules. It chipped away at her very sense of self. In private, she was Diana, a young woman searching for connection. In public, she became Her Royal Highness, a carefully constructed figure that represented an institution more than a human being. The more she perfected the performance, the less room she had to simply exist. Sociologist Irving Goffman once wrote about the presentation of self, how people play roles in everyday life to meet social expectations. But Diana's role wasn't casual or temporary. It was relentless, a performance with no intermission. She was always on stage, always under surveillance, always required to be the flawless princess that the monarchy and the media demanded. Behind the tiaras and gowns, the act was exhausting. This paradox made her life unbearably heavy. She was admired everywhere she went, yet powerless within the walls of her own home. Millions adored her smile, but inside Buckingham Palace, her voice often went unheard. She could charm a nation, but couldn't make her marriage whole. She could inspire strangers, yet feel invisible to those closest to her. And the cruelest part? Every time she faltered, every crack in the mask, it only deepened the cage. The tabloids circled, The monarchy tightened control. The performance had to be polished even further. To the public, Diana was a storybook princess. To herself, she was slipping into a role that was swallowing her whole. But what truly hollowed her wasn't the performance itself. It was the silence inside the noise, the loneliness she carried even in the middle of the crowd. She was never truly alone, yet she often felt profoundly solitary. Surrounded by staff, photographers, advisors, and crowds chanting her name, she carried a silence no one else could hear. It was the kind of loneliness that doesn't come from absence, but from presence without connection. She admitted it herself in an interview. The biggest disease this world suffers from is people feeling unloved. And I know that disease. For Diana, those weren't just words. They were her daily reality. For someone seen by millions as the most adored woman in the world, the irony was heartbreaking. Applause and admiration filled the air around her, but what she longed for was intimacy. To be seen not as a symbol or spectacle, but as Diana, a human being. That recognition rarely came. Psychologists warn that chronic loneliness is not simply an emotion. It becomes corrosive to the self. It tells the brain you are unwanted. It eats away at your worth. And it turns even crowded rooms into mirrors of isolation. For Diana, this was daily reality. The cheers of the public didn't soothe the ache of being unheard in her own marriage, unseen in her own family, and unprotected in her most fragile moments. The contradiction defined her collapse. For most performers, silence comes when the show is over, when the stage lights dim and the audience goes home. But for Diana, silence came in the middle of the performance itself. Inside the cheers, the flashes, the royal appearances. It was as if the louder the world became around her, the quieter she felt inside. And loneliness, when it lingers too long, reshapes how a person sees themselves. Diana's world adored her image, but it left her doubting her own worth, her own place. A woman who gave so much compassion to strangers was left starving for it in her own life. Her spotlight made her visible to everyone, yet it was in that very visibility that she felt most invisible. And this was where the fracture deepened, when the cheers that looked like devotion became instead a cruel reminder of how unseen she truly was. And yet, out of that pain came something unexpected. Diana carried a rare sensitivity to the people the world overlooked. What left her feeling unseen gave her the ability to truly see others, the sick, the forgotten, the ones society kept at a distance. She walked into hospital wards during the height of the AIDS crisis, sat beside patients others feared, and reached out with bare hands to prove they were human, not untouchable. She stepped into minefields in Angola, not a spectacle, but to say with her presence that these hidden dangers destroying lives could no longer be ignored. In those moments, she stopped being a symbol of glamour and became something much deeper, a mirror for suffering itself. Psychologists call this the archetype of the wounded healer, an idea Carl Jung explored, that those who have suffered most often develop the strongest instinct to ease the suffering of others. Diana embodied it completely. Her own wounds gave her the ability to recognize pain others turned away from, to bring tenderness into places that had been starved of it. But the truth of the wounded healer is hard. Helping others doesn't erase your own wounds. If anything, it can make them sharper. Diana could lift others, but lifting herself was far harder. Each gesture of compassion carried an invisible cost. Every embrace, every visit, every tear shared with strangers poured from a reservoir that was already running low. Her public kindness became her private drain. Philosophically, this reveals a haunting truth. The very qualities that make someone extraordinary to the world can quietly hollow them out inside. Diana's empathy looked effortless, but it was born of fragility. She gave so much outwardly that little remained to sustain her own healing. The world saw a radiant humanitarian, a princess redefining her role with courage and warmth. But beneath it, Diana remained the wounded healer, a woman whose gift for soothing others left her own pain unresolved. She could comfort nations, yet still returned to her rooms feeling uncomforted. And in that contradiction, the fracture widened. Adored for her compassion, yet starved for the same tenderness she so freely gave. But the deepest struggle wasn't in what she gave to others, it was in what she faced alone. When the applause faded and the cameras lowered, she often turned inward, and what she found there was a war against herself. It wasn't spectacle, it was silent battles fought in private. Bulimia, depression, and moments of self-harm. Not gossip, not scandal, but the body becoming the battlefield for a soul that felt cornered. Psychologists explain that eating disorders often grow from the search for control in an uncontrollable world. And for Diana, whose life had been scripted by others since she was 19, her body became the only place left where she could take control. Choosing when and how to eat was its own desperate rebellion. But the relief was fleeting. Each episode left behind not freedom, but shame, another reminder of how trapped she was. Depression followed like a shadow, darkening even the brightest rooms. She spoke candidly of it later, describing nights of despair and days when she felt like she was not good enough for this family. To the public, she was elegance and strength. In private, she sometimes saw only fragility. The contrast itself became exhausting, to be adored by millions, yet unable to adore herself. Friedrich Nietzsche once observed that when the mask becomes unbearable, the body protests. Diana lived that truth. Her illnesses weren't only medical, they were messages. The bulimia, the self-harm, the emotional collapse. They were all the body's way of screaming what her voice could not say aloud. That she was drowning under roles, expectations, and betrayals too heavy to carry. The tragedy is that her suffering was often misunderstood. In a world hungry for perfection, her struggles were treated as flaws rather than signals of pain. Yet if you look closely, they weren't weakness at all. They were evidence of how much she was carrying, how hard it is to keep living as an image when the person behind it is breaking. This war with the self revealed perhaps the deepest paradox of Diana's life. She was strong enough to change how the world viewed compassion, but fragile enough to question her own worth. She fought battles privately that few ever saw, and the scars of those battles became part of the collapse the world only understood when it was too late. But if her inner world was filled with struggle, the outer world made it heavier. Wherever she went, she was never truly unseen. Paparazzi followed her into cars, onto sidewalks, even onto private holidays. A walk with her children could dissolve into chaos under flashing bulbs. What should have been ordinary moments of peace became public property, dissected by strangers who never met her. Philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about the gaze, how being endlessly watched strips a person of freedom and turns them into an object. Diana lived inside that gaze. A smile was taken as proof she was content. A frown was splashed across front pages as scandal. A tear became weakness. She wasn't seen as Diana, a complex human being, but as an image, a symbol sold by tabloids and consumed by millions. The paradox was cruel. The world adored her, but it also imprisoned her. Admiration filled magazines, yet left her with no safe space to simply exist. Even when she sought escape, like gym sessions or private dinners, the lens was always there. Her life became a show she could never exit, where the very love of the public added to her suffocation. And the cost was invisible but devastating. Being constantly watched reshaped how she saw herself. Every gesture, every laugh, every outfit became a performance she could never step out of. Year after year, the photographs stacked up, but they told only half the story. Dresses without the sadness, smiles without the silence that followed. For Diana, visibility became its own kind of invisibility. Her collapse wasn't hidden in darkness, it was hidden in plain sight, beneath images that showed the dress but never the despair. And if the cameras stole her freedom in public, betrayal stole what should have been her refuge in private. The world saw a royal marriage, but behind palace walls, she lived with the ache of knowing she had never truly been chosen. Prince Charles's love for Camilla was no secret to Diana. It was a shadow cast over the marriage from the very beginning. For her, this wasn't just disappointment. It was a wound that cut at her very sense of worth. She often spoke about the loneliness of sharing her life with a man whose heart belonged elsewhere. To be a wife in name but not in love was a daily humiliation. To the world, the photographs showed two figures standing together. But what they never revealed was the absence between them, the tenderness missing, the intimacy that was never there. Philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once wrote that the deepest despair is not being chosen, the feeling of not being enough for the one you love. Diana lived inside that despair. To the world public, she was beautiful, admired, even idealized. Yet in the one relationship where she longed to be seen most fully, she was eclipsed. The contradiction was cruel. Millions adored her, but the person closest to her looked past her. This betrayal did more than wound her heart. It deepened the collapse of her identity. It told her that no matter how kind, graceful, or radiant she was, she could not be enough. That quiet message ate away at her self-esteem, fueling the battles with bulimia and depression that already weighed on her. The applause of strangers could not erase the silence at home. And betrayal doesn't just remove love, it multiplies loneliness. To live in the shadow of another woman while smiling for the cameras was a torment few could imagine. Every public appearance with Charles became another mask, another reminder of her invisibility. The tragedy is that Diana's marriage, which should have been her refuge, became another theater of pain, betrayal playing out behind closed doors while the world clung to the illusion of a fairy tale. Love had been promised, but distance was delivered. And for Diana, that gap between what she longed for and what she received widened into one of the deepest fractures of her life. It was a wound no applause could heal. But from that wound came defiance. After years of being shaped, silenced, and betrayed, Diana began to fight back in the only ways she could. She broke protocols that had held other royals in place for centuries. She shook hands without gloves when told it was improper. She wore clothes that defied palace traditions. She spoke directly to the press when silence had once been demanded. Most of all, she told her own story, candidly admitting to her struggles with bulimia, depression, and betrayal in interviews that shocked the monarchy but gave millions of ordinary people a reason to trust her more. For a moment, it seemed like she was reclaiming herself. Away from the palace, Diana began to shape a new identity. As a humanitarian, as a mother deeply devoted to her children, as a woman searching for independence. She wanted to prove she was more than a title, more than a symbol trapped in someone else's story. And yet, every step toward freedom only tightened the world's grip on her. The monarchy pulled further away. The tabloids grew more ruthless. Photographers chased her car doors, helicopters followed her vacations, and even her most private relationships became fodder for headlines. The more she tried to live as Diana, not Her Royal Highness, not a fairy tale princess, but simply herself, the more the world turned that search into spectacle. This is the cruel truth of Diana's final years. She was not destroyed only by inner wounds, but by outer systems. The monarchy, the media, and a culture hungry for drama worked together to box her in. Her collapse wasn't only personal, it was also structural. The weight of institutions, traditions, and relentless public obsession pressing down until there was almost no space left to breathe. And then came the quiet, the haunting stillness before Paris 1997. The world remembers the crash, the headlines, the shock. But what came before was a woman caught between freedom and captivity, speaking louder than ever, yet feeling unheard, reaching for life, yet constantly pulled back into the machinery of spectacle. Her final days looked calm on the surface, the eerie quiet that often comes before tragedy. And it is in that quiet, even more than in the crash itself, where the deepest collapse of Diana's life is revealed. That same quiet before Paris leaves us with more than sorrow. It leaves us holding a mirror. Not just a mirror to Diana's life, but to our own illusions about love, strength, and visibility. Her story reminds us how easily we mistake beauty for safety, service for wholeness, visibility for being truly seen. We adored the image, but we failed to see the ache beneath it. Diana was both light and warning. Light because her compassion reshaped how millions understood dignity and care. Warning because even a life celebrated by the world can collapse in the spaces we refuse to look. What about you? Have you ever noticed someone hiding pain behind a smile? Share your reflections in the comments. Your story might be the mirror someone else needs. And if you'd like to keep exploring the truths we so often overlook, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the stories hidden in plain sight are often the ones that change us most.